Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. I am super excited to have you here. Today, we're going to look at something that absolutely dominates our news feeds, it shapes our maps, and honestly, it defines our personal identities. Yet it's often deeply, deeply misunderstood. We're talking about nationalism. Now, we aren't looking at this as some partisan talking point today. Instead, we're going to examine it as this fascinating, almost invisible operating system of modern politics. It's a framework that quietly runs in the background of just about everything we do.
For a while there, especially back in the late 20th century, a lot of scholars confidently predicted the quote-unquote end of ideology. They thought nationalism was just this dying relic of the past that would simply fade away in our modern, super-connected world. But as we'll see today, that prediction was entirely wrong. Actually, nationalism is proven to be the most enduring, adaptable, and arguably the most successful political force of our time. It is absolutely not dying, it is actively, rapidly shape-shifting.
All right, let's get right into it and define our terms. Nationalism is the political belief that the nation should form the fundamental basis of the sovereign political order. Now, it's absolutely crucial to catch the distinction here between two words we use interchangeably all the time, the state and the nation. The state is the sovereign political entity, right? It's the government, the laws, the borders. But the nation? That's a social group that identifies as a community. So nationalism, at its core, is the belief that these two very different things must perfectly align into a single nation-state.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the core themes. Second, the kinds of nationalism out there. Third, nationalism in our century. And finally, we'll dig into the inherent tensions and paradoxes. Let's dive in.
Starting off with Section 1, Core Themes, or what I like to call the DNA of the nation-state.
So what exactly makes up this DNA? Well, we already touched on that nation-state alignment, right? But building on that is the idea of the organic community. Basically, nationalists view humanity as being naturally divided into these distinct nations. Next up is self-determination. This is the argument that because a nation is distinct, it needs a political unit tailored specifically to its own needs, meaning autonomy or independence. Then there's identity, the belief that humans are socially contextual beings. You really can't understand a person apart from their national community. And this is totally reinforced by culturalism. Shared myths, folktales, history. Think about why we fiercely defend our local foods or go absolutely crazy cheering for our Olympic teams. That's culturalism in action. And finally, sovereignty. This is the idea that ultimate legitimate authority is permanently tied to a specific territory, a homeland, or a heimat with clearly defined borders.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates why nationalism is just so remarkably potent. Our sources describe the nation as a homogeneous spiritual collectivity. It demands ultimate allegiance. It literally asks an individual to put their national identity above their economic class, above their religion, and even above their race. It is an incredibly powerful, binding force.
Moving right along to Section 2, Kinds of Nationalism, the flavors of belonging, if you will.
Now, this is arguably the most vital distinction to wrap your head around. Civic nationalism is, in theory, inclusive. Nationhood here is determined by your mindset, your political allegiance, and your voluntary loyalty. As long as you feel loyalty to the nation's political principles and you act on it, you belong. Contrast that with ethnic nationalism, which is deeply, deeply exclusive. Membership here is determined by things you literally cannot choose: inherent human differences, language, biology, ancestry, often referred to as a Volksgeist. So it really boils down to a contrast between belonging by choice versus belonging by birth.
What's genuinely fascinating here is that nationalism itself is actually completely neutral when it comes to the political spectrum. Historically, both the left and the right have utilized it to achieve wildly different goals. Liberal nationalism seeks popular self-government and individual liberties. Conservative nationalism, on the other hand, focuses on social cohesion and stability. Then you have expansionist nationalism, which fuels militarism and imperialism, driven by chauvinism, this toxic belief that one nation inherently has the right to rule over weaker ones. And then, conversely, anti-colonial nationalism uses the exact same core concepts to seek liberation and self-determination for colonized territories. It's the same tool, just used in totally different ways.
Let's bring it into the present day with Section 3, Nationalism in Our Century, essentially serving as an anti-globalization engine.
You know that friction you feel every time you scroll through the news today? A lot of it stems directly from these two massive, deep-seated social imaginaries just rubbing up against each other. The national imaginary is that taken-for-granted feeling that the nation-state is the only legitimate framework for politics. But rising up against it is the global imaginary, this growing awareness of the world as a fully interconnected whole, driven by global markets and instant communication. The global hasn't fully taken over, and the national absolutely refuses to let go.
So what actually happens when they collide? Well, nationalism basically mutates into this powerful anti-globalization engine. If you watch the news, you literally see these points every single day. We see a deep skepticism of supranational organizations, like the UN or the EU. We see a fierce resistance to what's perceived as alien global finance. We see demands for economic protectionism to shield local workers from global shocks. We see a really stark rise in nativism, the assertion that states should be exclusively inhabited by the quote-unquote native group. And we see nationalism increasingly converging with populism and religious fundamentalism. It's essentially a direct immune response to the forces of globalization.
And actually, speaking of religion, we've got to talk about the sacralization of politics. This is such a wild concept to me. Historically, nationalism emerged during the French Revolution as a way to replace absolutist monarchies where kings ruled by divine right. It literally replaced God with the nation as the source of sovereignty. But here is the incredible irony. To create that deep spiritual collectivity we talked about earlier, secular nations ended up stealing the exact religious playbook they just overthrew. They adopted collective rituals, they created sacred symbols, and they wrote these grand foundation myths so the state could function almost exactly like a secular religion.
Flash forward to today, and we're looking at this incredibly complex, messy overlap between religion and nationalism. Objectively looking at the globe, religion is frequently used as a tool for majoritarian nationalism. For instance, Hindu nationalism in India or Sinhala Buddhist nationalism in Sri Lanka, they use religion to define the true subjects of the nation, which, unfortunately, often results in the exclusion of minorities. But on the complete flip side, some religious ideologies actively reject the nation-state entirely. Islamist globalism, including radical movements like Al-Qaeda, they view human-made national boundaries as a direct affront to the absolute sovereignty of God. Their goal isn't to build a nation, it's actually to erase national borders completely and rebuild a unified global community, or Ummah.
Which brings us to our final section, number 4, inherent tensions and paradoxes, or, as I like to think of them, the glitches in the system.
So here's the really crucial takeaway. Nationalism is, at its core, basically a parasite. In academic terms, it's called a thin-centered ideology. It can tell you who belongs to the nation, sure, but it has absolutely no real answers for substantive political problems, like how to organize an economy or deal with social justice. To survive and actually provide a complete roadmap for governance, nationalism must attach itself to a thicker host ideology, whether that host is liberalism, conservatism, socialism, or fascism. Because it's this constructed framework, it leans on a couple of massive contradictions. First is the paradox of age versus modernity. Nationalists almost always invoke the myth of immemorial antiquity, claiming their nation has been around since the dawn of time. But historically speaking, nationalism is a highly modern 18th century invention. Second is the paradox of nature versus construction. Nationalists claim their identity is perfectly natural, just a matter of birth and kinship, yet sociology clearly shows us that nations are actually imagined communities. They're actively constructed by the state using very modern tools like mass education and national media.
And because of these paradoxes, nationalism plays what we call a Janus-faced role in history, meaning it literally faces two completely opposite directions at the exact same time. It has served as this glorious guiding light for emancipation and liberation against colonial rule. Yet the exact same ideological framework has been the central building block for some of the absolute darkest autocracies, fascism, and xenophobia the world has ever seen. It can liberate and it can oppress, and it entirely depends on the host ideology it attaches itself to.
I really want to take a second to unpack this quote from scholar Homi Bhabha. Essentially, what he's saying here is that a nation isn't just some static, dusty statue from the past. Citizens are taught in ancient history, yes, but they actually have to wake up and re-perform that identity every single day in the present. The nation is a story we simply never stop reciting.
And that brings us to our final, lingering thought for this explainer. As technology and markets continue to expand the global imaginary, what exactly happens to our deep-seated need for a national imaginary? Will our sense of belonging adapt and expand to include a wider, interconnected world? Or will it just retreat further behind defensive walls and increasingly exclusive definitions of who really belongs? I want to thank you so much for joining me today. Keep that question in mind as you watch the news this week, and keep pondering the ultimate trajectory of humanity's most powerful political belief. See you next time.